No, I'm Al Lochra. I was with a crew of 9. We went from 10 to 9 whenever we dropped one of the members because we didn't need one of the waist gunners. I was a radio operator gunner, ROG, and my place in the plane was approximately in the middle, exactly behind the bomb bay, but in front of the ball turret gun. So I had a room of my own. I had the best room in the whole plane. And that's probably literally so. And there were several radios in the room, but I didn't touch a couple of them because they were the pilot's radios, and they were hooked on. They were in the radio room, but they led from the pilot's position back to the radio room. So I worked on one radio. It was a 522R, I believe. It was a great radio, but I didn't do any voice on it. All of it was code and not much of that. I had to, my duty was to be in contact with them, and I had to do that about every hour or something like that. I had to get in contact and tell them I was still alive and what have you. And so I didn't have to do much transmissions. But I had to do some, and they were done. And and I used a regular machine, a tapping machine, with the code, da-da, da-da, da-dit, da-da-da, dit, da-da-da, and so forth. And all through the alphabet and the numbers, and then a couple of other symbols that you had to use. But that's what we used. We used about, counting the 1 to 0 and the A to 26, we used about 40 symbols is what we used with the codes.
Now, I know you said you didn't have to do that very much, but if you guys ever got into trouble on a mission or the plane was going to go down, what would be the job of the radio operator?
To get out of the plane as soon as possible, because by that time the pilots had already told people what was going on. I wouldn't have had time to take the code to do this. Unless you had trouble and still flying, that's fine. And if the pilot asked you to do something, and he did one time, second mission, matter of fact, we were coming over the English Channel, and he said, please send them an SOS message. So I had to go to get a different transmitter, not the transmitter. Each plane had 3, if not 4, 3 I think it was, transmitters, each one with different frequencies. And so I took the one frequency out, one transmitter out, and then switched it to a frequency that I was going to send this on, and I did so, and of course the preliminaries, some of which I've lost in the horse latitudes, and in the 75 years it's transpired since then. But I I did with the code what the problem was. Then I hit it a long, I don't know, maybe 10 seconds or maybe more. Kept the switch down on there, so a beep went out so that whoever was getting on the other end could make a fix on our plane. And when that was done, I put the transmitter back and went to my regular transmitter. We flew back, but we weren't very far, just too far to swim, but we weren't very far from the English coast at that time. When I say very far, probably within 50 miles. I don't know, something like that. And so we soon reached England, and the first first base we saw was enough landing space. We just landed there, and it happened to be a B-24 base, not our base. I think we must have been 15, 20 miles from our base. But when we landed, our third engine gave out of gasoline. We had lost one engine about an hour or two before we came to the bomb site. And I'm going backwards now, but the situation was everything was going fine, and suddenly, this is an hour or two before we dropped our bombs, our plane shook, started shaking. It was like a streetcar running on, instead of the tracks, on the rails itself. It just really bumped that much. I mean, we all were just up and down, up and down, up and down. And we thought the plane was going to come apart, but that B-17 held together. But we flew, and if I recall correctly, and I don't always recall correctly, it was either shortly before we hit the bomb site or right after. But suddenly the plane started to fly smoothly. And what happened was this, that when our engine went out, number 3 engine, left 1, left 2, right 3, right 4. Number 3 engine went out. We didn't know why it went out, but it went out. But we couldn't feather the propeller. And so running, as we were flying 160 miles an hour, or whatever it was, the propeller and the engine kept moving. So we couldn't we couldn't feather the prop, so the propeller was moving the engine, but no power whatsoever. It was a drag on the plane for 2 reasons. First of all, the engine was going back and forth with no power, and secondly, you don't fly a plane with 3 engines that requires 4 without using extra gasoline. So we were losing gasoline 2 different ways. And but when that engine gave out, the plane flew a whole lot smoother, and eventually they had to shut down engine number 2 because we were losing a lot of fluid, and we put all the gasoline from engine number 2 in toward engine number 1 and engine number 4. So before we got to the channel, we were flying on 2 engines, 1 and 4. And when we got over the channel, eventually, we still on those 2 engines, but when we started to land, and I told you that B-24 base, as we landed, the number, either the 1 or 4, gave out of fuel. So we were landing, but it was all right. We were already landing. We only had 1 engine, and we pulled up to where we were assigned to park our plane, and we stopped it, and everybody got out and congratulated everybody and so forth. But a day or 2 later, I believe it was our pilot, came to us and said, you know, we had enough gasoline left in that 1 engine, for the 1 engine, just to wash the oil off the side of the plane. We couldn't have gone more than a couple more miles in the air at that time. So we landed at the right time. So
was that the Berlin mission?
Yeah, it's the second mission we had, Berlin mission.
So when you guys were in the briefing room that morning and they pulled back the curtain,
oh
you
yeah,
saw the tape go to Berlin. Tell me what.
Everybody, well, when they had tapes going over, red tape from England to wherever you were going to target, no one ever wanted to see that tape, the line to go to Berlin. and there were some others bad too, but especially Berlin. And so when everybody saw Berlin, oh no, and this kind of stuff. But, that was the mission, whether you liked it or not. Yes, it was a matter of concern. But the non-commissioned officers, I like to call them officers too, but that's what NCOs, non-commissioned officers, and the regular officers. We had two different briefings. We weren't briefed together. So we got essentially the big picture on both, but the particulars. For instance, I was a radio operator and I got specific instructions, and the engineer got specific instructions. And then, of course, the officers, the two pilots, the navigator, and the bombardier, if there was a bombardier, got different instructions.
And you flew most of your missions with Butch Broyles as your pilot.
Yes,
what
he was.
What do you remember about Butch as a pilot and kind of a leader of your crew?
Well, I'm not supposed to quite say this, but they're all dead now, so the bombardier told me in Pittsburgh, when was that, 1990, whatever it was, or maybe 2000. He was at a reunion, and so was I. And he said, Al, Butch was a better pilot than the first pilot was. The first pilot was already a captain. He was a West Point graduate, and when he was announced as our pilot in Lincoln, Nebraska, when our crew was put together, man, a captain, and he had wire in his, he had the wire or whatever it is in his cap, but after it got overseas, he took the wire out of his cap so it would crumble like the rest of them. But anyhow, he was a real gentleman and a West Point man, too. And don't forget it, he was West Point.
Well, you guys definitely enjoyed Butch.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Butch was just a guy. Oh, yeah. And he would, in fact, I and several others were invited to have drinks with him. Well, at the time I wasn't drinking, but I drank something. Probably ginger ale or something of this nature. But yes, he's just as regular as could be. He fit in very well, and he visited us while we were in training in Rapid City, and a couple of times when we were in England at the Bomb Group in our squadron, 351st Squadron. Yeah, so.
When you talk to a lot of veterans now that flew on the Chowhound missions, a lot of guys will say that was, their most satisfying experience. What do you remember about that Chowhound mission that you guys flew?
Number one, it was the most satisfying one I ever flew. I do believe, because we were helping people, and while the Germans had control of the Netherlands at that time, where we were flying, the United States already had gone through Holland, and they captured what they wanted of it, and they left the Germans just stay where they were, because as the Germans were staying in Holland, they weren't affecting anybody, but we had to fly into their territory, and the Germans told us how to fly, how fast to fly, where to drop the food, and how to get out of there. And they had their guns trained on us, but they never fired a shot. And we flew at very low altitude, maybe several hundred feet, when we dropped the food out of our bomb bay. Our bomb bay had been modified to hold boxes of food. And when we got to that dropping point, the food was released and hit down there, and I watched it, and food went every place. I mean, they were boxed and so forth, and we didn't carry fresh eggs. Most of it was canned goods or something of this nature. But nevertheless, boxes broke and food all over the place. But most of it was retained and used. But that was a great, great flight and wonderful. And the Dutch people who saw us, they waved at us. But we weren't flying very high. We didn't use oxygen whatsoever on that whole trip from England to the Netherlands and flying back. And none of the gun crew. There were two of us. Well, wait a minute. There was a navigator, and there was the two pilots. There was 5 of us there in the plane, 5 crew members. The radio operator and the 2 pilots, the navigator, and the one who stood behind the pilots.
Top turret engineer.
What?
The top turret engineer.
The engineer, right. Top turret engineer, right. So we're the only ones that flew, and that's the only ones that had to fly, because those 5 always had to fly. And when a B-17 went up in the air, those 5 had to be in the plane. So that was great. Now that was a great, great mission, and maybe this one surpassed it. I don't know. I also had to fly over to Linz, Austria, one time with the 5 of us and pick up 30 or 35 French slave laborers. Now they were already corralled and put into groups of 30, I think it was 30 of them, groups of 30s from 100 yards apart or more. And when we flew our planes, and I guess we flew a dozen or so of our 100th Bomb Group people there at one time, and we were one of them, we would fly up to this batch of 30, and they would all get in our plane. It took about an hour to do this, so I got out of the plane and I walked around, but got back there. They got into our plane, so by that time there were 35 of us in that B-17. That's a lot of people in a B-17. But most of them bunched up together in the radio room and around the ball turret, and maybe some of them hanging on in the bomb bay, hanging on to whatever they could get hold of. And we took those slave laborers, and they were Frenchmen, all Frenchmen, and they had been working on farms or wherever they had to work, factories in Austria, and maybe Germany too, because Germany and Austria were right together at that place. At that city, and they worked there, but we flew them back to France, and I think some of them stopped in Paris and dropped and took care of them, but we went to Chartres, C-H-A-R-T-E-S, Chartres, France, and that's where we deposited our 30, and a lot of other B-17s did too, right there. And the most notable thing I remember there is we had a P-51 come in and buzzed us. And he knew what he was doing, but he didn't know what he was doing, one or the other. But he did a perfect buzz job on us, but he had no reason to do so. He scared the devil out of all of us. We all ducked. and I bet he wasn't more than 5 or 10 feet above the tail of a B-17 when he buzzed us. But boy, he came in there flying, I don't know how many hundreds of miles an hour, but he scared the whole batch of us. We all hit the ground, if that's what, or wherever we were. We hit the floor or the ground, whatever it was. But that was memorable. But we stayed there long enough to get rid of the 30, and then we flew back to England. But we brought 30 Frenchmen back to France from Austria. So that was a good flight, too.
Speaking of other jubilant times, you were one of the lucky few that happened to be in London on VE Day. What was that environment like?
I don't know if anybody was touching the ground that day. I didn't care. Well, of course I probably did, but I put in my notes, there wasn't a lamp post or anything of this nature in London that didn't have an American soldier on top of it or a British soldier on top of it. Every lamp post you could see had someone on top of it, and jubilation. And for the most part, you didn't need any money. They didn't. You could ride buses, and they didn't take anything up. Now, I didn't drink, so I didn't try that out, but I'm sure if I got anything to drink, they wouldn't have charged me anything. Or if they did, they did real good about it and so forth. But everything and everybody was wild and outside. There wasn't anybody inside unless you had to get inside. And out on the streets, everything was crowded and everything was overjoyed. Yes, it was maybe the happiest day that Britain had ever, before or since, enjoyed. So, yes, everybody was great that day. And even I stayed an extra day. I was absent without leave on the 9th. And I went back to my, on the 9th, one day absent without leave. And I said, I now wonder who's going to call me and tell me about it. No one even knew I was gone. So I had absent without leave, not recorded. So that was great.
I should have asked, but a lot of guys talk about what it was like getting ready for a mission the day of. But what was it like when you guys came back to base? I mean, just the exhaustion and relief.
Well, typically you hadn't eaten supper, and if you had lunch, it was out of a small box. You know, if you had lunch at all. So you hadn't eaten since 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, typically. Well, maybe not 3, but 4 or 5 or 6 o'clock. You had eaten your breakfast and then gone up and got your plane ready. And well, when you got ready to get in the plane, but you had to put the guns in the plane. And I always put the radio gun in, and sometimes I had to put the nose guns in. Just depended, and got them ready. Of course, now you didn't get them ready to fire just yet. You did that after you got up above and got over the channel. Then you fired your gun to make sure it worked. But you didn't fire it until you got over the channel. And then you hoped they'd work. And 99, 44, 100% of the time they worked. So it was all right. But you had to do things around the plane. You had to pull the props, one thing. And some of you will know what you mean by pulling the props. You had to rotate the engine by pushing the propeller around. I think we did it 3 times, but that was to get the oil flowing a bit into the engines, because shortly after that they started the engines. The pilot started the engines. So you pull the prop, and if there's anything else you needed to do around the plane for whatever purpose, I would go in there and check to see if my radio was working, and of course others, the gunners had no particular thing to do, except the ball turret would try to find out if his ball turret was working, and so on. And well, just getting ready. But the pilots had the most to do about that. And,
you said when you guys came back, you were pretty starving by that point.
well, I hardly ever get hungry. I mean, really hungry. So, yes, some people were starving. Yes, as such. And we would go, after we got back to the plane, we had to deposit our air flight uniforms there. They were kept at close to the airport itself, one of the hangars there. And you are in your other garb, and if you were wearing some other clothing, you pick that up and just walk just as you would as a regular GI on base. And then you just walk to the cafeteria, get your meal, and then go back to your, in our case, a tent. We had a great tent. It was better than a lot of the barracks there, because there were only 5 of us in it, first of all, and we had bunks for 6. So there were, and the tent was pretty large and comfortable. We had a coal stove, and with the chimney going up through the middle of the top, and the top was protected, so if it got hot enough, the tent wouldn't catch on fire. So it was fine, and the stove kept us very warm, and we slept very nicely.
One thing I thought was interesting is you had a chance to go back and see that site when you revisited Thorpe Abbott's years later. What was it like to go back to your old base?
Well, I was surprised, but yeah, maybe not. The platform that they put down for that tent was concrete, 6 inches or more thick. It's still there. The whole square, it was a square of concrete there. I'm guessing the size now, 10 by 10, something like that. And it's still there and could be used today for the same purpose. And it was located, maybe 150 feet from our headquarters building. And very, very right up close to some barracks where usually 2 crews in each barracks, but there was only 1 crew in our tent. But that tent, as I said, was maybe better than its barracks. So
I imagine you guys had a tremendous reception from the British folks that volunteer at the museum there when you went back.
Oh yes. The British have things pretty well lined up. You see the same people a whole lot, and they're interested in this, and the old ones, now some of them are as old as we are, or older. They welcome us a whole lot. Now I don't know about the new British citizens, how well they welcome us, but that's just the way of life. The old ones really appreciated us, and we appreciated them too. We had good rapport. So.
I think the last thing I was going to ask you is, for people who have never been to a 100th Bomb Group reunion, it might be hard for them to understand why those events are important. Especially some of the early reunions you went to. Tell people why what those events mean to you and why it's important to congregate with your fellow veterans.
Well, I think the older we get, and if we remember each other, and some of us don't, unfortunately, and everybody that I know of, when you go there, you want to go up and hug them. And if you recall their names, you'll call them by the first names, you know. And you're well met, and you're more than welcome. And if you want to hear some stories, they'll tell you some. But most of our attendees are now the children or the uncles or the nephews or the friends and so forth of the veterans. I think